Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Rutherford Hayes, and the focus is reform efforts. The year is 1877, and while we talked in the last episode about critical issues in Hayes' presidency with end of Reconstruction and the plight of Southern blacks, it wasn't the only issue on his plate. There were a couple of others that were important to him that he talked about, in fact, during his inaugural address. Two of them were currency and civil service reform. In terms of the currency, well, the United States had borrowed a whole bunch of money, went deep in debt during the Civil War, in large part by printing paper money, greenbacks, which were inflationary in their nature. And Ulysses Grant, in his second term in particular, wanted to get an end to this. He wanted to get back to a specie-based economy, specifically one based on gold, where a dollar was going to be a dollar at any time during a transaction. Well, he signed into law the Specie Resumption Act, which said in January 1st of 1879, which was going to be on his successor, Rutherford Hayes' watch, the United States would start to redeem those greenbacks in gold. Hayes was completely in support of this. Hayes has been a hard currency guy for quite some time. He had supported the law when it was originally passed. He was happy to watch it go into effect on his watch. But there were plenty in the country who were against this, particularly borrowers, people who were in debt. In the South and in the West in particular, a lot of farmers were in this camp. Why? They liked the inflationary nature of the paper money. They could borrow in gold, pay it back in paper, and actually make something. The lenders would lose out on this. The borrowers would actually do well. And so they believed if they were going to go to a specie-based economy, they at least wanted silver to be in the mix because it was similarly inflationary, kind of like the paper money, where they could make out and actually make some money when they paid back their debts. If they took them in gold, paid back in silver, they would do well. Well, Hayes, this was anathema to him. He was totally against it, but the Congress was sympathetic. And in February of 1878, they passed the Bland-Allison Act, which mandated that the United States government purchase $2 to $4 million in silver every month and convert it into coin that could then be used in these kinds of transactions. Again, Hayes was against this. He vetoed it, and he said, in view of these facts, it will be justly regarded as a grave breach of the public faith to undertake to pay these bonds, principal or interest, in silver coin worth in the market less than the coin received for them. The standard of value should not be changed without the consent of both parties to the contract. National promises should be kept with unflinching fidelity. There is no power to compel a nation to pay its debts. Its credit depends on its honor. But for the only time in Hayes' presidency, Congress overrode his veto, and the Bland-Allison Act went into effect. This issue of gold versus silver, debtors versus lenders, this would be a pretty big issue in the United States government for the next 20 or so years. The other major issue facing Hayes from the economy standpoint was labor relations. Now, labor relations, the United States federal government had typically stayed out of this. This was considered more of a state or a local issue. But things got a little bit out of control here in 1877 for a railroad strike. Railroad workers were upset. During the Panic of 1873 and the subsequent years of economic hard times, wages would fall, job security would fall, but the bosses in these corporations were still making pretty good profits, and the workers were tired of it. So they went on strike, beginning in West Virginia, in Martinsburg. They walked out, they blocked the tracks, they shut down the railroad, and pretty soon there was another one. The B&O Railroad in Maryland also went on strike, and this one got a little violent. The governor of Maryland asked the President of the United States for help. He couldn't suppress this violence all by himself, and sure enough, Hayes sent in about 260 federal troops. They quelled that violence, and the strike kind of petered out. But this was just the tip of the iceberg because the railroad strike spread to 14 states and nearly 3 million railroad workers walked off the job. And yes, there was vandalism. There was violence, and 9 state governors turned to the federal government and asked for help. They also wanted federal troops to come into play. Well, again, the federal government had typically stayed out of these kinds of disputes, and Hayes wanted to figure out what were the ground rules, under what conditions should he actually bring federal troops into the mix. So he called his cabinet together, and they came up with 2 main rules. The first one was that the governor of the state had to ask for help. Basically had to say, I can't handle this by myself. I need the help of the federal government. But the second part was also had to be true, which meant either federal assets specifically had to be at risk or U.S. citizens had to be in immediate peril. If those conditions were met, Hayes was willing to send troops, and he did on several occasions. Now, he might have thought he was sort of being a neutral party in all of this, just trying to keep the violence out of the mix, but the fact was that this really undermined the leverage of the workers who were out on strike. Once the troops showed up, any threats by the workers were pretty much going to be non-existent, and most of these strikes were pretty much settled relatively quickly, almost all in favor of management, in large part because the thumb of the federal government, by the arrival of those troops, was very much put on the scale on the side of management. The other major topic in his address was that one of civil service reform. Well, this was a topic that had really been getting out of control, this idea of political patronage, which had been around since the beginning of the Republic, but had really become now almost more of an art form and embedded deeply into the political process, where these party bosses would basically do this. They would say, you want to get elected in my state? Then you're going to have to give me the ability to hand out your jobs, your patronage jobs. And I'll do that to my supporters, to your supporters. They're going to vote for you, and we'll just keep this cycle going. You'll stay in power, I'll stay in power, and these bosses were becoming very powerful. Well, Hayes despised this whole process. He thought it was not only unfair, it was bad for the country, and he said in his inaugural, calling for a change in the system of appointment itself. A reform that shall be thorough, radical, and complete. A return to the principles and practices of the founders of the government. They neither expressed nor desired from public officers any partisan service. They meant that public officers should owe their whole service to the government and to the people. They meant that the officer should be secure in his tenure as long as his personal character remained untarnished and the performance of his duties satisfactory, which had really not been the case. It had all been about these political bosses turning out jobs in terms of trying to maintain power and pass it on for the next election. Early in his tenure, Hayes went further. Party leaders should have no more influence in appointments than other equally respectable citizens. No assessments for political purposes on officers or subordinates should be allowed. No useless officer or employee should be retained. No officer should be required or permitted to take part in the management of political organizations, caucuses, conventions, or election campaigns. Again, he wanted reform that was radical and complete, and these were fighting words. He was taking on those political bosses who weren't about to take it lying down. In particular, the senator from New York, Roscoe Conkling, who very much controlled the patronage in his state. If you wanted to get elected in that state or nationally to get those votes, kind of ran through him, and he would orchestrate the support so he could hand out jobs to the supporters. Well, the eye of the storm was the New York Customhouse. This was the most lucrative patronage position in the entire federal government. It was the #1 point of revenue collection in the federal government, and Hayes believed there was corruption and graft in the New York Customhouse. He wanted to focus on the collector, Chester Arthur. That's right, the future president, Chester Arthur, the collector of the Custom House in New York, and the chief naval official at the Custom House, Alonzo Cornell. And he wanted an investigation, and that's what he had his Treasury Secretary John Sherman set up. Sherman called in John Jay, the grandson of the founding father of the same name, who began that investigation. In the meantime, Roscoe Conkling was appalled at this. How dare this president come into my state and in my custom house and do this kind of investigation? And he went public, condemning Rutherford Hayes, nasty, sarcastic comments at the New York State Republican Convention in September of 1877. And a lot of the other bosses around the country were siding with Conkling. This was their livelihood that was at stake. Rutherford Hayes was unmoved. He was committed to this. This is why he took a one-term pledge in the first place, so he could take on these political bosses. He went forward and nominated replacements for Arthur and Cornell. He went for Theodore Roosevelt Sr., the father of the future president, as the Custom House collector, and L. Bradford Prince as the naval official to replace Arthur and Cornell. Now he's got nominations. Now he's in the domain of Roscoe Conkling, because now it's in the Senate for confirmation. And Conkling happened to be the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. So what did he do with these nominations? Initially, nothing. He sat on them, took no action all the way until the end of that Congress. Well, Congress reconvened, Hayes renominated both of them, and this time Conkling decided to take some action. Very aggressive action against the nominations. His committee forwarded to the full Senate a strong recommendation to deny these nominations as a direct affront to what they called senatorial courtesy, which had become the tradition where senators would have quite a bit of say on appointments in their own states. And sure enough, the Senate complied, Roosevelt and Prince were rejected, and Hayes acknowledged in his diary that Senator Conkling has won a great victory over the administration. My New York nominations were rejected 31-25, but the end is not yet. I am right and shall not give up the contest. To his credit, he waited, he bided his time. Congress went into recess in June of 1878. He waited a couple of weeks, and then he fired Chester Arthur and Alonzo Cornell, and he replaced them with recess appointments, Edwin Merritt and Silas Burt. Well, Conkling was fuming over this, wailing to the press about what a terrible thing this was, but there was nothing he could do for a few months until Congress came to the point where it reconvened in December of that same year. Things had been shifting a little bit. The Democrats had won seats. They were now starting to come into more power. And while they were not necessarily in favor of Rutherford Hayes, they were very much against the power in the Senate of Roscoe Conkling. And now they had the votes to approve these two nominees of Merritt and Burt, and Rutherford Hayes was able to celebrate. According to Hayes, I have had a great success. No member of either house now attempts even to dictate appointments. My sole right to make appointments is tacitly conceded. If the boss system is to go down, I can say I struck the first and most difficult blows. And in this case, he was correct. He didn't end this whole patronage fight. That would actually go into the next presidential administration, and a whole bunch of interesting things would occur to kind of start to bring the boss structure down. But he did strike the first blow, and it was probably the singular triumph of his presidency. But it also came with a cost. The Democrats rising in power, they weren't going to help Hayes in any of his agenda, and now the Republicans really turned on him because they wanted Conkling and their own power. And so now Hayes really had no constituency left in Congress on either side of the aisle. The newsman Chauncey Depew made the comment that President Hayes, although one of the most amiable, genial, and companionable of our presidents, with every quality to attach men to him and to make warm friendships, was nevertheless one of the most isolated. He kind of knew this going in. He took that one-term pledge so he could take on this corruption in his mind in civil service reform, but he paid a price for it in a lack of any support in Congress over the last couple of years of his administration. Now, the top reformer in the cabinet was Carl Schurz in the Interior Department, and he was the most aggressive. This was a department that needed cleaning up because there was graft under Ulysses Grant in the Interior Department. In fact, Schurz made the comment that the agency was simply a license to cheat and swindle the Indians in the name of the United States of America. He sacked a number of the leaders. He put in accountability measures. It primarily worked. He really did a good job of cleaning up the Interior Department, and his boss was thrilled at this. Unfortunately, the Indian relations part of their responsibility did not go so well. There was once again violence between the American settlers, the American military, and the Indians. There was the Nez Perce War, the Ute Uprising. Rutherford Hayes' answer to this, like in many topics, was universal education. Just like he wanted for blacks and poor whites, he wanted it for Indians as well. And sure enough, in little pockets, he made little bits of inroads, but this was a much bigger problem that was not going to be solved on the watch of Rutherford Hayes. One final action of Hayes of note: in 1880, his last full year in office, he decided to do something about an eyesore in his backyard called the Washington Monument, which had been sitting at about a third finished level for about the last 25 years. There had been no movement on it, and Hayes said, enough's enough. We're going to go get the money appropriated. We're going to get this thing finished. And sure enough, in 1880, on August 7th, they laid the cornerstone to start the next level of build of the Washington Monument, and he was thrilled to come back 5 years later for the dedication to the founding father of the country. So he did make some inroads in civil service reform. That was probably his greatest moment of his administration, but let's face it again, this paled in comparison to the setbacks that were suffered to blacks in the South when he ended Reconstruction, but this is all part of the efforts of Rutherford Hayes as the 19th President of the United States. That is Rutherford Hayes and reform efforts from the life of Rutherford Hayes. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.